Humanity has always loved stories, whether fiction, non-fiction, or somewhere in between. Some of humanity's longest living stories are of military triumphs, passed down through hundreds of generations via oral tradition or scant notations, and spread that way between whole continents. It is fair to presume that through so many retellings, the truths of events have been twisted around reality. Even two first-hand observers of the same event may have different recollections or points of view. Still, the peculiarity of such long-told stories is that there tends to be only one surviving or agreed upon, even allowable version of events. These we refer to as myths. The nearer events are to us in time, the less likely we are to describe them as such. Likewise, there must be a sense of grandiosity, almost a suspension of disbelief. For example, no one would seriously refer to the holiday they just returned from as a thing of myth, as the events were too recent and mundane. This isn't to say, however, that a myth can't form extremely quickly nowadays, with the advent of mass communication filtered through media, governments, writers and such. In fact, it's probable that more lasting and powerful myths have formed in the last century than the last millennia. It is with this process that the Second World War has become myth, not just in itself, but a new national founding myth for several nations, artificially rocketing the importance of the event's perception over the lasting material outcomes. Yet, the further we have travelled from the Second World War in time, the fewer surviving witnesses with first-hand accounts there are, and the more stories, media and political arguments that rely on it, the more mythic it's become. With this essay then, I shall be demythologising one consequent strain of World War II, and one particular genre of media that revels in the use of the war as a setting, for its narratives, and as a basis for its propositions and morality. We'll start by looking at the harsh reality of World War II. World War II was relied upon for propagandistic purposes of narrative control, as well as mundane, money-making entertainment. For this, incredible strife is shown in some media to elicit emotional response and show the seriousness. However, the material and metaphysical reality of war is worse than most media depicts, particularly with World War II. The First World War and Vietnam, for example, are irreconcilable conflicts in the zeitgeist. They can only ever be represented negatively, as showing them as such is useful for the liberal globalist argument. Your typical boomer media consumer, if asked to rate the brutality of fighting in these wars, would likely rank World War II last. They may even be incidentally correct in some aspects, but their understanding of such things is entirely at the whim of Hollywood and scriptwriters. They only think in regime-approved narratives. For a better perspective, let's start by putting ourselves in the shoes of somebody in World War II. For every 1,000 US servicemen, most of which will be non-combat roles, still 8.6 were killed in action, 3 died from other causes, and 17.7 received non-fatal combat wounds. The fatality rate of wounding was 30%. US forces alone had 405,000 deaths and over 670,000 surviving wounded, at a time where healthcare and prosthetics were less advanced. But these figures pale in comparison to the tens of millions lost on Europe's Eastern Front, the tens of millions lost in East Asia, and the at least 70 million total deaths from the war, most of which were civilian, this making it the deadliest conflict in history. In the 6 years of worldwide conflict, would you have survived unscathed? Death was present in daily life wherever the war touched, and cultural, historic and religious sites were under threat as well. In the 8-month sustained German bombing campaign against Britain, the Luftwaffe damaged or destroyed 2 million homes, 60% of which were in London alone. There were in the city 18 Christian churches entirely eviscerated. On one day alone, 6 hospitals were bombed. Landmarks like Westminster, the British Museum, and even Buckingham Palace were badly damaged. Still, this came to be nothing compared to the retaliatory campaigns against Germany and Japan. The Dresden bombing campaign, that lasted just 3 days, had just 23% of industrial buildings damaged there, but 56% of non-industrial buildings damaged too. Around 78,000 dwellings had been completely destroyed. Over a third as many dwellings were destroyed, and more than half as many civilians killed or injured in the 3 days of the Dresden bombing than in the 8 months of the Blitz. British historian Max Hastings said that by February 1945, Attacks upon German cities were irrelevant to the outcome of the war, and Dresden particularly resonated with people all over Europe. The home of so much charm and beauty, a refuge for heroes, a landmark. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theatre, the Allied bombing response to Japan saw 2/3 of their capital of Tokyo's mostly traditional wooden buildings destroyed. Then the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki alone killed 214,000 civilians. Supposedly for the greater good of ending the war quickly, the two A-bombs dropped within 3 days of one another ended up killing more than half as many civilians as the whole of both the Allied and Axis bombing campaigns throughout Europe through the whole war. Demographically too, many once great peoples were ruined. Millions of innocent ethnic German civilians were expelled from Eastern Europe, with the Soviets committing mass rapes, executions, torture, looting and repression. These territories would then become Soviet satellite states for the duration of the Cold War. Poland, particularly, being the country that Britain and France went to war with Germany over, had been ethnically cleansed, including by our supposed allies of the USSR. Huge gender imbalances became apparent throughout the war-affected countries, forcing women to stay and work, having been drafted in during the conflict. Divorce rates doubled during the war and then kept increasing. This and the separation of men at war meant a temporary drop in birth rates until the baby boom that decades later resulted in an imbalanced population pyramid which is still used to justify socialist policy and mass immigration. West Germany, for example, imported 867,000 guest workers from Turkey alone in the span of a decade. In the 80 years since, Europe as a whole has likely taken in tens of millions of people and their progeny from further afield, irrevocably altering the character of these fighting nations. Crime increased massively during the war, increasing by 60% in England between 1939 and 1945. The economy being in shambles, the usual social order broken down, rationing in full effect, good men sent to fight abroad, and the stress of it all concocted this circumstance. Total war extracted everything from people, with the highest rate of income tax being 99.25%, which remained at 90% for decades thereafter. This economic destruction lay exactly the groundwork for lasting socialist policy and justified the Windrush generation that supposedly helped rebuild Britain. The loss of empire worsened these issues as the anti-colonial pressures from America, including the money and materiel Britain had leased from them, made holding on to the empire infeasible. No more preferential trade, a weakened international prestige, and unending tolls from participation in the war took the life and soul of a weary British people. The Bulldog, biscuit tin, Spitfire, rah-rah jingoism had been used up. Despite Churchill saying he'd not become the Prime Minister to oversee the dissolution of the British Empire, that is precisely what he'd caused. The moment the public was given a choice, they voted him out in favour of a Labour government. Yet, in decades since, the conditions of wartime Britain and the Blitz spirit are held up as the pinnacle of British attitudes and identity. Never mind those who lived through it, immediately ejecting its leader, the rationing that ended only in 1954, the clear setback in the whole country's living standards. This immense collective trauma remembered only through the lens of nostalgia. The last stories told of it by those who grew up then, not knowing life before the ruin. Around the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Programme, Britain received an emergency loan of $3.75 billion. Much of this money used by Attlee's Labour government then to fund idealistic social housing, welfare and healthcare programmes, all of which would be quickly used up and the services eventually overrun by foreigners. Resultant from the war, most countries involved came to ruin and had to write their history anew to justify their involvement post hoc. Possibly the United States alone had come out in a net positive position. The national founding myth of World War II is primarily of their creation, and in being so positive, is completely dissonant to the realities of the war in Europe and Asia. The liberal democratic post-war consensus is the supposed best thing to come out of the war. It too is clearly a negative. Needless to say, World War II was not fun. So why do some people want you to think of it as such? This terrible experience of World War II was not felt by everybody, and those who would produce its most popular representations in media would indeed be those who didn't. One man's story is a good example. Stanley Martin Lieber was born in New York City, 1922, to his Romanian Jewish immigrant parents. In 1939, as a young adult, he joined the Federal Theatre Project, one of Franklin D. Roosevelt's public works projects, part of his New Deal. Thanks to an in from his uncle, Robbie Solomon, he became an assistant at Timely Comics, later to be Marvel Comics, owned by Martin Goodman, born Mo Goodman, who also published some rather raunchy magazines on the side. Stanley's cousin Jean was Goodman's wife, and had been hired as well by editor Joe Simon, born Jaime Simon. His debut was working on a Captain America text comic in 1941, Captain America having been created by Jaime Simon and artist Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg. These two later making it clear that the character was indeed an overtly political creation, explaining the intent was to make clear their objections to the Nazis and their supporters in the United States, as well as isolationists who argued to avoid getting into the war. With this comic, Stanley took up the pseudonym of Stan Lee, claiming comics were low status and that he didn't want to be associated with them, though he later took the pseudonym on as his legal name. When Simon and Kirby left Timely Comics, Lee was made editor and stayed as such until he succeeded Goodman as publisher in 1972. In that time, Lee would create such superheroes as Captain Marvel, Black Panther and Wonder Man. However, back in the 40s, the USA had joined the war, and so Lee signed up for the Signal Corps. Starting with basic handiwork, he was able to get into the training film division to produce material for the war effort. There he took on the role of playwright, one of only 9 in the whole army. He worked there with people like William Saroyan, an Armenian-American novelist, Frank Capra, born Francesco Rosario Capra, an Italian-American film director, Theodore Zeus Geisel, also known as Dr. Zeus, a German-American cartoonist, and producer Hunt Stromberg Jr. In 1945, at war's end, Lee returned to New York to take back his spot in comics, which had been helmed in the meantime by Vincenzo Francisco Gennaro de Fago. By the late 50s, Lee became tired with the business, however, and considered moving on, until competition came in the form of DC Comics and their editor Julius Schwartz, who revived the superhero archetype with The Flash and the Justice League of America Super Team. In the 60s, Lee began a monthly column called Stan's Soapbox. In that, and the comics, he wrote about social justice issues and topics like the Vietnam War, ongoing political elections, and student activism. Black characters also started to appear as political gestures, and Gene Colan created the first African-American superhero, the Falcon. There was eventually even the forceful changing of the comics code by the writing into a Spider-Man story an element of drug use. Lee spent the 1970s tuning his public persona as an amiable, all-knowing guide to comics. Internally at Marvel, though, he was facing rifts with artists and writers over everything from content to labour conditions. At one point, Lee's old boss, Martin Goodman, and his son Chip formed a new rival publisher and recruited top talent to work on comics for them. Lee responded by sending his freelancers a letter that implored them not to contract with other companies. In it, he compared his competitors, including the Goodmans, who were Jewish, to Nazi Germany, and Marvel to the Allies. From the 80s onwards, Lee had several misadventures in trying to produce live-action superhero films and raunchy cartoons. In the 90s, he'd bankrupted the company and sold it off to Disney, staying on as a figurehead with little to no control. Only after the reins had been handed over in the 2000s did he become a mainstream figure, through merchandising and appearances within the Marvel Universe and at conventions. With Lee becoming a figurehead, he took on a mythic quality, especially so as an architect of the prevailing World War II myth and the subsequent civil rights and Cold War rhetoric. Some irony has to be acknowledged with his rise to success having made use of the superhero archetype, which had been strived for in Germany during the war with the idea of the Übermensch. The absolute archetypal Western Uberman is, of course, Superman. Though not of Lee's creation, it's an interesting example, created by Jewish immigrants Jerome Siegel and Joseph Schuster, though the character being sold to Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz of DC Comics. Superman was an alien, born with great powers, who'd been evacuated from a dying planet to America as a child and raised in their culture. He'd then have the real and secret personas of Clark Kent and Superman. Lee and many of his colleagues also had twin personas. The one he wanted the world to see was that of the modern mystic. His cameos in Marvel and other films cemented this, giving him an omnipresence that lasts despite his death. Post-death, in fact, his likeness was licensed for 20 years by Marvel. Even prior to his popular superhero movie cameos, however, he had an appearance in the 1995 film Mallrats, where the protagonist calls him a god.
Oh my god. Holy shit! Aren't you?
Oh, Stanley. Hi.
I can't believe I'm standing here talking to you. You're responsible for the greats. Let's do the list. Spider-Man.
Guilty.
The Incredible Hulk.
Afraid so.
Oh man, this is so cool. The X-Men.
Now that you mention it.
Shit, man, you are a god!
In his high school yearbook, Lee had wanted to reach the top and stay there. And he had, both forming the zeitgeist and becoming part of it. As remodelling of its reality, the lasting narrative of the war was useful both as a setting for a genre of media, and thereby made marketable, but also as the new absolute truth. An odd combination, but necessary, as much of Western society has since been built on it. Interestingly, while many elements of its history are free to replicate or parody, some are not, and doing so can even result in a criminal offence. With that exception being clear, we'll conclude by talking about just certain elements. The Second World War was a deadly, horrifying experience for many, and at best put a pause on people's careers for a few years. Both during and after, superhero comics were a light form of idealistic, patriotic entertainment. Particularly the young men reading them would not have had much information about the events of the war from their relatives, mostly through propaganda news headlines and entirely fictional comics instead. It was perhaps something to bond over between generations, but ultimately the representation offered by the medium is simplified for mass appeal and is false. The formulaic good guy bad guy dichotomy couldn't even last past the civil rights era, wherein the post-war order, now at odds with the USSR's communism, needed to re-tack. Superheroes began having faults, dealing with drug abuse, resenting their powers. To this day, that formula has remained, frozen in time, where the greatest enemies are the worst incarnations of Germany and Russia. This being taken to an absurd level in society, with accusations of being some mid-century dictator being levelled at even very liberal people who accidentally step out of line. In this paradigm, the Allies must always be diverse and yet in absolute agreement on their principles. The likes of Captain America, synonymous with the creation of the ideal American, personifies this. Even Cap himself can be represented as an African American or spun off into other people altogether. It's only in the joint fight against the shared ultimate enemy that we can define ourselves as truly together. Our unity in this paradigm is predicated on this consensus. Our nations and histories now depend on the colour of comic books and the black and white of the war. The good guy always wins in the end. Against this paradigm built on falsities, where we may never be allowed to move on, I can recommend knowing your history, your own history, well. Don't decry the importance of the ongoing cultural connection, the zeitgeist. Differentiate the retelling and self-insertion in your history by those who deserve to do so and those who do not. History is what we make it, and if we don't, someone else will. So, stay tuned to Meta Britain and Excelsior.